Sometimes the biggest danger in a national park isn't nature itself. It's the choice you make while you're in it. From refueling a hot camp stove and watching it explode into flames, to skipping the bridge for a log jam and becoming pinned beneath the logs. Hi, I'm Nathan, and welcome back to Fatal Files. It was September 14th, 2017. Early fall had settled over Glacier National Park, Montana, and the backcountry cooled off quickly after sunset. For backpackers, that usually meant gathering around a camp stove to make dinner. Evan Larkin was 31 years old and tried to squeeze in a few backpacking trips every year whenever work allowed. He enjoyed planning routes almost as much as hiking them, and before every trip he spent time trimming unnecessary weight from his pack. This was a 3-day loop through the park with a longtime friend, and because they expected chilly evenings, Evan packed a liquid-fueled backpacking stove instead of a small canister stove. Liquid fuel stoves are popular with backpackers because they perform well in colder temperatures, but they require a little more attention than most people realize. Unlike small canister stoves, they need to cool completely before being refueled. I wouldn't be surprised if plenty of experienced backpackers have assumed they could get away with one quick refill. The first day passed without any problems. By the second evening, they had reached a designated campsite surrounded by pine trees beside a narrow creek several miles from the nearest trailhead. After pitching their tent, Evan unpacked the stove while his friend prepared the food. They had covered plenty of miles that day, and both were looking forward to eating before the temperature dropped any further. A few minutes into cooking, the flame began sputtering before going out completely. Evan picked up the fuel bottle and realized he had packed only enough for what he thought the trip would require. He had simply misjudged how much they would use. There wasn't enough left to finish dinner. His friend suggested waiting several minutes before refilling the stove, or even settling for the food they already had. Evan looked at the half-cooked meal sitting in the pot and decided waiting wasn't worth it. He figured that if he poured carefully, he could refill the stove without any trouble. The campsite was quiet, except for the steady sound of water flowing through the creek. Evan shut the stove off, loosened the fuel cap, and tipped the white gas bottle over the fuel reservoir. As fresh fuel entered the stove, invisible vapors drifted across the still hot burner. They ignited almost immediately. A bright flash erupted around the stove before either camper had time to react. Evan instinctively jerked backward, dropping the fuel bottle onto the ground. More fuel splashed across the dirt and ignited as soon as it spread. Flames raced around his boots before climbing onto his clothing. He tried pulling his burning shirt over his head while stumbling away from the stove, but the fire spread faster than he could get it off. His friend grabbed a nearby pot of water and threw it toward the flames, but the burning fuel continued spreading across the ground. Realizing it wasn't working, he immediately began shoveling dirt over the fire before wrapping Evan in a sleeping bag to smother the flames still burning on his clothing. By the time the fire was finally out, Evan had suffered extensive burns across his arms, chest, neck, and face. I think this is one of those situations where a few extra minutes feels like forever when you're cold and hungry. Looking back afterward, those same few minutes would have been nothing. There was no cell service anywhere near the campsite. Evan's friend activated the satellite emergency communicator they carried for emergencies and transmitted their location. Because they were deep in the backcountry, rescuers needed several hours to reach the campsite on foot with medical equipment. Evan was stabilized before being flown out once weather conditions allowed. Evan died several days later from complications related to extensive thermal burns. Investigators recovered the damaged stove, the partially melted fuel bottle, and the remaining camping equipment from the campsite. Their examination found no mechanical defect or equipment failure. The evidence showed the stove had been refueled while it was still hot, igniting the white gas vapors almost instantly. His death was ruled accidental. This is one of those stories that's probably going to pop into my head the next time I'm tempted to rush something at camp. Over in Colorado, one visitor saw an elk that looked like it needed help. Walking closer turned out to be the biggest mistake of the trip. It was October 8, 2016. Autumn had settled over Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado, and the annual elk rut had brought visitors from all over the country. Pullouts along the park roads filled throughout the day as people stopped to watch the massive bulls roaming the open meadows. Todd Marcus Wheeler was 38 years old and had driven to the park with his wife for a weekend getaway through Colorado. He enjoyed photographing wildlife whenever they traveled, although most of his experience came from local parks and nature preserves rather than large national parks. That afternoon had already been a memorable one. They had spotted mule deer, bighorn bighorn sheep, and now the elk everyone seemed to be stopping for. During the fall rut, bull elk are extremely territorial. They can appear completely relaxed one moment and charge the next with very little warning. If park staff receive reports of an injured or entangled animal, trained personnel handle the situation. Visitors are instructed to keep their distance even when it looks like the animal needs help. I can understand why someone would want to help. The problem is, the rule doesn't stop applying just because you're trying to do something good. About a dozen people stood along the roadside watching the elk through binoculars and camera lenses. Every few minutes, another vehicle pulled over after noticing the small crowd. The bull barely acknowledged them, continuing to graze while occasionally lifting its head toward the road before lowering it again. Eventually, someone noticed what looked like a length of plastic cord tangled around one of the elk's antlers. Every so often, the bull shook its head, sending the loose cord swinging through the air. Several people commented that they felt bad for the animal. Todd quietly watched for several minutes before saying it looked like something that could be cut away in just a few seconds. Someone nearby replied that it was probably better to notify park staff, but Todd wasn't convinced anyone would arrive before the elk wandered off. He pulled a small multi-tool from his backpack and started walking into the meadow while everyone else stayed near the road. At first, nothing happened. The elk continued grazing, only occasionally looking up as Todd slowly closed the distance. He stopped more than once, giving the animal time to react, but it simply lowered its head and resumed feeding. His wife called out for him to come back, but Todd told her he was almost there. I've noticed people naturally get a little closer when an animal doesn't seem bothered by them. It's easy to mistake tolerance for trust. By the time Todd was only a few feet away, he had already unfolded the small blade on the multi-tool. He slowly reached toward the tangled antler. The elk instantly lowered its head and charged. Todd spun around and tried to run, but he had barely taken 2 steps before the elk slammed into him from behind. The impact threw him to the ground. The bull wheeled around and struck him again before trampling him as he tried to curl into a protective position. Witnesses shouted from the roadside but stayed back because the elk remained agitated and continued pacing around him for several moments. Eventually, the bull turned and ran deeper into the meadow. Todd's wife called for help while several bystanders directed responders to the exact location. Medical personnel reached the scene a short time later, but Todd had suffered catastrophic injuries to his chest and abdomen. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators found no evidence that the elk had behaved unusually or been provoked beyond Todd's close approach. They concluded the attack was a defensive response by a wild bull during the rut, and his death was ruled accidental. The elk was not euthanized because it had reacted naturally to someone entering its space. Park officials later reminded visitors that even when an animal appears calm or seems to need help, the safest choice is to keep their distance and notify park staff instead. Good intentions don't mean much to a wild animal that thinks it's about to be grabbed. Next, we're in Wyoming, where a bear wasn't wandering into a campsite by chance. It was following the scent coming from one particular tent. It was July 19, 2015. Summer camping season was in full swing at Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. By nightfall, campgrounds had settled into their usual routine. Campfires burned low, tents zipped shut, and every camper still had one last job before turning in for the night. Janine Kendall was 29 years old and was visiting Yellowstone with one of her closest friends during a week-long road trip through the western United States. Neither of them had camped in bear country before, and after spending the day watching geysers and wildlife, they arrived at their campground tired but excited to finally spend a night inside the park. Every campsite included a large metal food locker, and during check-in, campers received the same instructions everyone else did. Anything with a noticeable scent belonged inside before going to bed. That meant food, drinks, coolers, cooking supplies, toothpaste, deodorant, sunscreen, lip balm, and even gum. Bears rely far more on their sense of smell than their eyesight, and they don't care whether the scent comes from a steak or a tube of toothpaste. I think that's what catches some people off guard. A lot of the things we don't think twice about still smell interesting to a bear. After dinner, Janine and her friend began putting the campsite away. Her friend picked up the cooler and started walking toward the food locker before stopping halfway across the campsite. They talked about the early start they planned the next morning and figured it would only mean carrying everything back again in a few hours. Before long, the cooler was sitting inside the tent instead. A bag of trail mix followed, then toothpaste, deodorant, sunscreen, cooking utensils, and a few other small items they planned to use before leaving. Have you ever talked yourself out of doing something because tomorrow morning seemed close enough? It usually sounds like a pretty reasonable plan at the time. The campground had been quiet for several hours when Janine woke to a faint rustling outside the tent. At first, she assumed another camper was walking back from the restroom. Then, something heavy brushed against the side of the tent. Seconds later came a loud thump, followed immediately by the sound of fabric ripping. A black bear had entered the campsite after following the scent coming from inside the tent. The bear forced its way through one side of the shelter as both campers scrambled awake. Janine's friend managed to crawl out through the opposite side almost immediately before running toward neighboring campsites, yelling for help. Janine became tangled beneath part of the collapsing tent while sleeping bags, backpacks, and other gear shifted around her. As the bear searched through the tent for the cooler and other scented items, it repeatedly struck and bit her while trying to reach them. By the time nearby campers reached the site, shouting and banging cookware together, the bear had already wandered away carrying several food items. One camper called emergency services, while others stayed with Janine until responders arrived. Rangers secured the campground and temporarily closed nearby campsites while they searched the area to make sure the bear had left. Despite the quick response, Janine had suffered catastrophic injuries during the attack and was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators determined the bear had been drawn to the campsite by food and other scented items stored inside the tent rather than the campground's required food locker. Janine's death was ruled accidental. Because the bear had entered an occupied campsite and fatally injured a camper, park officials located and euthanized it. The incident prompted another reminder that in bear country, anything with a scent belongs in the designated food locker, no matter how early you're planning to leave the next morning. A bear doesn't care whether it's your first night or your last. It just follows the scent. From Yellowstone, we're making our way to Yosemite, where one decision to ignore a trail closure put a hiker directly in the path of a rockfall. We've got plenty more stories like these on the channel, so if that's your kind of thing, I'd love to have you stick around by subscribing. It was May 27, 2018. Spring had returned to Yosemite National Park, California, and with it came one of the busiest hiking weekends of the year. Waterfalls thundered from the winter snowmelt. Temperatures were comfortable, and trails throughout the valley were packed with visitors. Looking around that morning, most people were probably thinking about the views ahead, not the cliffs above them. Dean Osborne was 45 years old and worked as an electrician in Northern California. Friends described him as someone who preferred spending vacations outdoors whenever he had the chance. This trip through Yosemite with his younger brother had been on their list for years, and they planned to fit in one last hike before driving home the following morning. The previous winter had left sections of granite fractured high above several trails. Even after the snow disappeared, repeated freezing and thawing could leave loose rock hanging in place for weeks or even months before it finally broke away. Because of that, some trails remained temporarily closed while unstable areas were monitored. Some of the most serious hazards are also the quietest ones. Just because a cliff looks solid doesn't mean it is. Late that morning, the brothers reached a barricade blocking part of the trail. Multiple signs explained that the closure was due to recent rockfall and instructed visitors not to continue beyond the barrier. Some hikers read the signs and turned around. Others walked around them. Near one end of the barricade, a narrow dirt path had formed where enough people had already stepped around the closure. As Dean stood there, he watched several hikers returning from the restricted section without any obvious problems. He remarked that if people were already coming back from the trail, it probably wasn't as dangerous as the signs suggested. His brother disagreed and said he'd rather not take the chance. Dean hesitated for a moment before deciding to continue on alone. I've caught myself doing this before. Once you see someone else ignore a warning without consequences, it gets a lot easier to believe you'll be fine too. The closed trail followed the base of a towering granite wall before disappearing around a bend. For the first several minutes, the hike felt completely normal. Other than the sound of rushing water in the distance and the occasional bird call, nothing seemed out of place. Then came a sharp cracking sound from somewhere high above. Dean stopped and looked up just as several fist-sized rocks bounced down the cliff, scattering across the trail ahead of him. He instinctively stepped backward and turned toward the way he had come, but before he could get more than a couple of strides away, a much larger section of granite broke loose from the cliff face. The rock crashed onto the trail, striking Dean and throwing him several feet into the brush beside the path. His brother heard the impact from the other side of the barricade, followed moments later by a cloud of dust rising above the trees. He shouted Dean's name several times, but received no response. Rather than crossing into the closed area himself, he called emergency services and guided responders to the location from the open trail. He remained at the barricade while rescue personnel evaluated the cliff, knowing that entering too soon could put even more people beneath unstable rock. Once specialists determined the slope was stable enough for rescuers to enter, Dean was found dead from catastrophic blunt force injuries. Investigators concluded Dean had been struck by a rockfall within the closed section of trail, and his death was ruled accidental. The trail remained closed while geologists evaluated the cliff and crews removed additional unstable rock before it was reopened to the public. Park officials said the closure had been in place specifically because the area remained at risk for further rockfall. I think we've all looked at someone else doing something and assumed they knew something we didn't. Sometimes they were just taking the exact same chance. Our final story takes us to Washington, where one hiker tried to save a few minutes by crossing a log jam. He ended up fighting the river instead. It was August 11th, 2017. Summer was beginning to wind down at Olympic National Park, Washington, but the trails were still busy with weekend hikers. Snowmelt from the Olympic Mountains kept the rivers running high well into August, even on warm, sunny afternoons. Standing on the riverbank, though, it was surprisingly difficult to appreciate just how much force the water was carrying. Holly Atwood was 34 years old and worked as a graphic designer in Seattle. Friends knew her as someone who rarely turned down a chance to spend the day outdoors. She wasn't chasing extreme adventures. She simply enjoyed finding new trails whenever she had a free weekend. She and two longtime friends had planned this hike for weeks, hoping to squeeze in one last summer trip before work became busy again. Several miles into the hike, the trail approached a wide glacial river. The official route crossed by way of a wooden footbridge a short distance upstream before looping back to the main trail. Downstream, years of fallen trees had collected into a sprawling log jam stretching from one side of the river toward the other. From where they stood, many of the larger logs looked dry, solid, and wide enough to walk across. I have to admit, if you didn't know any better, it would be easy to mistake it for a natural bridge. One of Holly's friends pointed toward the footbridge and suggested staying on the marked route. Holly looked back at the log jam instead. It seemed like the quicker option, and from where they were standing, she couldn't see any obvious reason it wouldn't work. They stood there for another minute talking it over before Holly finally said she'd go first and let everyone know how stable it felt. She stepped onto one of the larger logs. It barely moved. After taking several careful steps, she turned around and told her friends it felt sturdy. One by one, they followed behind her, leaving a few feet of space between each person as they made their way across. For most of the crossing, everything went smoothly. Holly tested each step before shifting her weight, carefully making her way toward the opposite bank. Then, only a few yards from the end of the log jam, she stepped onto a narrower log wedged between two much larger trunks. The log rolled without warning. Holly dropped into a gap between the logs, and before she could pull herself back up, the current forced one of her legs beneath the pile. Within seconds, the rushing water pinned the lower half of her body against the submerged timber. She grabbed the surrounding logs and tried desperately to pull herself free, but every movement was met with the full force of the river. Her friends rushed back across the log jam and reached down to grab her arms. They pulled together several times, but she wouldn't move. The current was simply too strong. One of them climbed onto a neighboring log and tried reaching her from a different angle, while the other ran back along the trail calling for help. I can't imagine how helpless that must have felt. She was only a few feet away, yet the river had already made her almost impossible to reach. Other hikers quickly gathered along the riverbank. Someone called emergency services while others searched for anything that might help, including ropes and long branches, but nobody could safely get into the current without risking becoming trapped themselves. Specialized swiftwater rescue teams reached the scene as quickly as conditions allowed. Before they could reach Holly, crews first had to stabilize parts of the log jam because shifting logs posed a serious danger to both rescuers and anyone caught beneath them. Despite their efforts, Holly died before they were able to free her. Recovery crews spent several more hours dismantling sections of the log jam and securing the surrounding logs before they could recover her body. The medical examiner later determined that Holly died after becoming mechanically pinned beneath the submerged logs by the force of the current. Park officials again reminded visitors that log jams are never intended to be used as river crossings, regardless of how stable they appear from shore. I think we've all looked at two options and wondered if the longer one was really worth it. This time, it was.